Hi everyone and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you've just found this place, then welcome, and if you're returning, I'm glad to have you back. I'm Alex and this is my channel where we explore and theory craft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Today we are doing another one of our quick builds where we'll be exploring a briefly summarized character build for D&D 5e. As always with our quick builds, if there are ever any builds you'd like to see me explore in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments below. Today's request comes again from Trampled by Yellow, who had another idea for an interesting character build with some unique restrictions. The build concept here is that we are trying to build a Shadow Barbarian. However, we're not allowed to use anything from Tasha's, no homebrew stuff, or anything else that's like an extra supplement besides Xanathar's Guide to Everything. I did double check just to make sure that any setting specific books would also need to be excluded from these restrictions, and sure enough, we're just looking at making a Shadow Barbarian with the 5e Player's Handbook and Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Starting in character creation, just to get our background out of the way, any background should probably be able to work with our Shadow Barbarian. There's nothing that specifically speaks to it, though if you had one in mind that was a little bit more thematically appropriate or that you felt would work a bit better than others, then definitely pick that one. For our lineage as well, anything should work for our build, just like our backgrounds. Now ideally I would love to pick up the Shadarkai lineage from Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse, because it fits so well as being this Shadowfell touched elf and having shadowy abilities. However, because of the restrictions, I'm going to say that we can't, and instead we're actually going to go with Half-Orc. Half-Orc doesn't provide anything specifically shadowy, but it will come in handy later on in the build for some mechanical benefits. Though if you wanted a lineage that specifically felt like it had control over the shadows just from being that lineage, Drow or Tiefling are both great options to get access to the Darkness spell innately through your lineage. For our stats, because again we can't use Tasha's Cauldron of Everything to get the optional rules to rearrange our stats, I'll assume that we're just going based off of what Half-Orc innately offers us, which is a +2 to Strength and a +1 to Constitution. With that, we're going to want the following ability scores. 16 Strength after putting 7 points into it to get us 14, with the +2 brings us up to 16. 4 points into Dexterity gets us 12 Dexterity. We're going to have 16 Constitution as well, putting 9 points into it and then adding the +1 to get to 16. We're going to leave Intelligence and Wisdom both at 8, and we're going to round off our stats with Charisma at 14 by putting our last 7 points into that. So now that we know how our stats are arranged and how they're a little bit weird and spread thin given that we're a barbarian trying to add some charisma, how are we actually going to build this Shadow Barbarian? Well, for first levels of 1 to 5, we're just going Barbarian. We're not multi-classing because we do kind of want to scale up to get extra attack as quickly as possible, as well as a first free feat in order to increase our strength to 18. If you wanted to multi-class earlier, you certainly could, but for us, just for the sake of scaling, we'll go up the first 5 levels into Barbarian, and for our subclass, we will take Ancestral Guardians Barbarian. We're obviously going to reflavor the Ancestral Spirit type of feel for this subclass to be more shadow-oriented, though Ancestral Spirits already are kind of undead, and the undead and shadowy type subclasses tend to blend together pretty well anyways. So it's up to you whether you want to just leave the Ancestral Guardian Spirits as spirits, or pretend that they are full encapsulating shadows. At level 6, we're immediately going to multi-class over into Sorcerer, and this is where we get the rest of our shadowy theme by picking Shadow Sorcerer. Shadow Sorcerer and Ancestral Guardian are both from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, so they're both fair game for this build. Shadow Sorcerer is going to give us a lot, and we're going to go up to at least level 6 as a Sorcerer. That will be total level 11 for us. As a Sorcerer, we get the following. Strength of the Grave is one of the first features we get, and it's why I picked Half-Orc. Strength of the Grave specifically says that when damage reduces us to 0 hit points, we can make a Charisma save that has a DC of 5 plus the damage taken. On a success, we instead drop to 1 hit point. We can't use this if we're dropped by radiant damage or a critical hit, and we can't use it again if it succeeds until the end of a long rest. But if it fails, we can try again, so that's pretty nice. Now this pairs really nicely with Barbarian as a whole, but also Half-Orc. Half-Orc has an ability where once per long rest, if we were to drop to 0, we actually drop to 1. And Barbarian, in part of their base class, eventually gets a similar feature as well. I have a lot of features that make us feel like this unholy, shadowy, ever-present and relentless force of darkness trying to bring down our enemies. Plus, one thing that is actually kind of neat about Strength of the Grave is that normally, on a regular Shadow Sorcerer, it's not as great of a feature because even though it's a Charisma save, and Sorcerers are good at that, the DC is 5 plus the damage taken. If we were at 4 hit points, let's say, and we get hit by an 8 damage attack, for a Sorcerer that would be a DC 13 to try to not drop to 1 hit point. For our Barbarian though, assuming we're raging, and assuming the damage type is something that we have resistance to, we're actually going to be taking only 4 damage to get to exactly 0 hit points, which means the DC would be 9 instead of 13. Even though we're not that great at Charisma saves, the ability to use resistance to actually lower the DC of this ability is going to allow us to get a little bit more value out of it, which is pretty cool. The other feature we get is Eyes of the Dark. Eyes of the Dark gives us dark vision out to a range of 120 feet at level 1. We already had dark vision as a half-orc, but now we just have longer dark vision, so that's pretty cool. And then eventually at level 3, we'll learn the Darkness spell for free, and if we use 2 sorcery points to cast it instead of using a spell slot, then we can see through the darkness that we created with the spell. It's basically like getting the Devil's Sight and Darkness combo completely for free. Also at level 3 we get to pick up Meta Magic, but the thing about this build is that we don't really need Meta Magic. If you like Meta Magic, feel free to pick anything up, and Twin Spell can be pretty good for twin casting a spell like Longstrider, which is a buff spell that doesn't have concentration, because we can use it on ourselves as well as someone else, and keep the benefit while we're raging. Using our sorcery points to cast darkness could prove more valuable. The reason is because even though a barbarian usually wants to rage, and rage does butt heads a lot with spell casting, especially spells with concentration like darkness, we don't always have access to rage. If your party tends to have more than a couple of fights in a single session, or is in the middle of a dungeon crawl of some kind, it actually may be better to try and save our rages for more crucial fights. Or if we're just trying to get through a lot of tough fights right away, then we might run out of rages really quickly. But with access to cast darkness, and the ability to see through that darkness, that allows us to get the combo of debuffing an enemy by casting darkness on them, and then getting advantage on our attacks against that enemy. It's not going to be great for dealing with a lot of enemies, but in a fight where we just want to be able to lock down one enemy and take them out while the party deals with everything else, it could be really nice, especially if we either don't have a rage or would rather save our rage for a more important fight. At level 11, aka level 6 Sorcerer, we gain the main feature that's going to make us feel like a Shadow Barbarian, and that is Hound of Ill Omen. Hound of Ill Omen lets us actually summon an entity of pure shadow to aid us in combat. What it says is, as a bonus action, we spend 3 sorcery points to summon a Hound of Ill Omen to target one creature within 120 feet of us. The Hound has a Direwolf stat block, its size is medium, it has temporary hit points equal to half our sorcery level, it can move through creatures and objects, but it can't end its turn there or it'll take damage, and at the start of its turn, it automatically knows the target's location. Now, ironically, I kind of built around this feature when I was recreating the Deathwalker from the Frosthaven board game. When we were exploring this feature for that character, I noticed a few things, and that is that there's not a lot of restrictions on this feature. Number 1, the Hound only disappears if it's reduced to 0 hit points, if its target is reduced to 0 hit points, or after 5 minutes has passed. There's also no limit on how many times we can reuse the feature after we have summoned a Hound of Ill Omen. And because there's also no restriction on concentration, and it's not considered spell casting, we can actually use this while raging. This means that not only are we a big barbarian who has some shadow theme from our ancestral guardians, now reflavored to be actual shadows that are protecting our allies, but we can also coalesce those same shadows, even while we're in the middle of a rage, to actively become a creature intent on harming our enemies. We're not just the Shadow Barbarian, we're a Shadow Wolf pack leader. And more than that, we are now a barbarian who is also a summoner to some extent. Even though the summons aren't that particularly powerful and they're restricted in who they can attack, they aren't restricted in how often we summon them, which means we can summon them pretty reliably. And because as a barbarian, we don't really care about using our spell slots for spells unless you really want to, we can just convert those spell slots that we have as another bonus action in combat to fuel more sorcery points to summon up more hounds. It can be a little niche, but would definitely excel in a big boss fight where you're trying to just hit a single target. I would imagine the rounds of combat would look something like this. Round 1, we rage, run up, hit the enemy. Round 2, we summon our first Houndeville Omen as a bonus action by spending 3 sorcery points, and then we hit the enemy again. Round 3, we do the same thing that we did on round 2. Because we are 6th level, we have 6 sorcery points, we spend the last 3 of them to get a second hound out. Round 4, if combat is still going at this point, we're going to convert one of our 2nd level spell slots into 3 sorcery points, and then on round 5, we're going to summon up another Houndeville Omen. And again, we've been attacking the enemy throughout that entire time with not just ourselves, but with the other hounds that we summoned initially. We are a major threat that spawns more threats and protects them at the same time thanks to our levels in Ancestral Guardian. Because we reflavored that subclass to be shadow themed as well, we are now fully manifesting the shadows around us to both attack our enemies and protect our allies. We are certainly a Shadow Barbarian. Now it's time to look at what we really have. Well, as a Shadow Barbarian, we are hard to put down. We're a half-orc with Strength of the Grave, and eventually we could end up picking up Relentless Rage, making it literally hard for us to get put down because we have so many features that let us drop to 1 hit point instead of just falling to 0. If we were going to pick up Relentless Rage, I'd recommend going all the way up to Barbarian 14 and sticking with Sorcerer 6 because we don't really need any more Sorcerer levels. We can already do quite a lot with what we have. And as a level 14 Barbarian, we'll also get the Ancestral Guardian Capstone, which is Vengeful Ancestors, which pairs with their 6th level ability Spirit Shield. Basically, Spirit Shield is a reaction ability that lets us help protect our allies even more. Vengeful Ancestors is a buff to that ability that lets us deal damage to an enemy that attacks our allies. And we can just use this to play up more of that shadow theme by flavoring these spiritual abilities as shadows. If you wanted to flip it and go Sorcerer 14 and just stick with Barbarian 6 or some other split as well, that's fine too. The more things that we get in Sorcerer aren't too important. They would just be other various spells or spell slots and sorcery points, which we can use, but we don't really want to use because we like raging so much. Even though I think the Ancestral Guardian is a really great subclass for our build specifically, because it can be so easily reflavored to be shadows that we're controlling to defend our allies, I also like the idea of going Wolf Totem Barbarian. As a Wolf Totem Barbarian, we're not invoking a natural wolf spirit, we're invoking a Shadow Wolf spirit and then summoning our Shadow Wolf pack with us. Mechanically, it's not as advantageous, but it is a funny little gimmick to our theme that we could choose to do. Other than that, let me know what you thought of the build or what you would do or change to get closer to the theme of a Shadow Barbarian, with the restrictions that we have in mind, of course. I'm sure there are a lot of other different shadow, undead, or spirit-based barbarians that can be built out there, but they probably require a couple more source books than just the Player's Handbook and Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Other than that, thank you so much for coming on the journey with me, and I hope to see you in the next one.